This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
Thank you so much, Carla. And it is wonderful to be back for another Fromm session. This is one of the true highlights of my teaching vocation. I love being with you guys and the opportunity it gives me to talk about big, deep, interesting questions in a way that is not narrowly specialized, but that puts us in dialogue. And so I'll start by just emphasizing I do want to be in dialogue with you. A couple classes ago, I did a course on the lifespan revolution. And one of the, I think, takeaways from that class, one of the reasons Fromm is so valuable is because you age better, we all age better if we keep our minds engaged, if we keep learning new things. And the best way to do that is to be in dialogue. And so whenever you have a question, please don't hesitate. Put it in the chat. Raise your hand. Unmute yourself. I think that Carla, they can all unmute. Yeah, okay. So and I don't mind. As a matter of fact, I appreciate and some of the most interesting ways in which this material is unpacked is when we're in dialogue about it. So having said that, I am going to jump in, and if you know me, you know my real weakness is that I tend to bite off more than I can chew, and that will be the case with this class and today. And so let's get rolling, and we'll see how far we can get. And so, as you're well aware, the class today, and let me just, it takes me like 10 seconds to get everything set up so that all of this works. The class today is on making democracy work, and those of you who maybe know a little bit of contemporary political science know that I've taken the title of this class from a contemporary political scientist, a very influential contemporary political scientist by the name of Robert Putnam, and the subtitle was mine, Philosophy, Politics, Reform, and Putnam's book by this title is an empirical investigation of Italy.
I always turn my sound off. So.
I guess I'm hearing somebody in the background. So what I'm going to do, and that's
I went ahead and muted them.
Okay, thank you, Carla. And so the reason we mute you was not to keep you from talking, but to keep the background noise from coming into the class. We've got 50 odd people, I think, in this session. And the point being that whenever you want to unmute yourself, there are two things you can do. In the lower left of your screen, if it looks like mine, there's an icon that looks like a microphone, and you can unmute yourself just by tapping on that microphone, or you can hold your space bar down. So I was starting to say I stole the title of the class from Robert Putnam. Robert Putnam, in the book that's 25 years old and a career maker for perhaps the most influential political scientist in America today, former dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard University, now retired. His claim, and I'll be really direct and simple about this now because we're going to spend more time on this later, is that exactly the same institutions and he started in Italy, that was his case study, in northern Italy and southern Italy, institutions of local and regional democratic government worked much better in the north than in the south. And so what makes democracy work is not simply the character of the institutions themselves, but Putnam pointed us to the surrounding culture, and in particular what he called the level of civic engagement and the trust and networks and capital that being engaged build. And so this is then the beginning of an explanatory paradigm. It's not just about institutions, it's about the broader social world in which those institutions are situated. And I want to be as clear as possible. Our political institutions in 2023, as we head into the 2024 elections, are more or less the same as they were 70 years ago. Some important changes, especially the civil rights, the feminist revolutions. But having said that, the core institutions themselves are in many respects continuous, and yet they seem not to be working nearly as well in the third decade of the 21st century as they were working in the middle decades of the 20th century. And I want to try to explain that. I want to try to get not only a good understanding of why democracy seems to be malfunctioning in the 21st century, but also, most importantly, what we can do to repair it. And my gambit is that we need to look at philosophy in order to understand the attraction of democracy. We need to look at politics in order to understand the dysfunction of democracy. And we need to look at reform informed by both the philosophical and the political perspective to figure out what we can do in the present to repair American democracy, because I want to be as clear as possible. And the first big thing I want to do with you today, after I give you a little overview of the course, is explain to you why I think that we are in a period of genuine jeopardy for American democracy. And so you can see for the cover image of this class, I've contrasted what I take to be three inspiring images from democracy. One of them, the drafting of the American Constitution in Philadelphia 230 odd years ago, right? And it's a real testament to the power of that document, to the wisdom of the people who drafted it, but also to the force of the American people, who have not simply let that document remain stale and static. And so I point you to the image of Martin Luther King speaking at the National Mall some now 60 years ago, right? We just marked that anniversary. And the important role of people like Dr. King and movements like the civil rights movement in taking that document from the 1780s and making it work for the second half of the 20th century. And then I point you to an image of a 2022 polling place and point out, right, that we have men and women and Black people and white people, and it appears Latinos and Muslims all voting in the same polling place, all orderly. And it appears, if you look at the bunting and the costumes people are wearing, patriotically doing their duty. And so I contrast that then with the image of the invasion of the Capitol on January 6th, the idea that the Supreme Court is increasingly a haunted house where nobody dares go except those conservative rulers in robes. The other, I think, chilling image from January 6th, the noose, the scaffolds erected in front of the Capitol, in a sense, a noose not only for maybe Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi, but for American democracy. And then I remind you of the Reichstag fire, of the idea that democracy is fragile. It can be overturned, and it is most often overturned from within. And I need to be as clear as possible with you. I am deeply concerned about the threat to American democracy in the 21st century. I think all of the signs point in the direction of growing fragility and threat to American democracy. And so that's where I'll start today before turning back the clock 300 odd years and looking into 17th century revolutionary philosophy and its role in the founding of democracy. So today's lecture is on the philosophical foundations, the origins of modern democracy in that philosophy, and the efforts to institutionalize that democracy in the age of revolution. And I've put on the board an image from Delacroix, which is an image meant to represent the French Revolution. And it's often taken to be a reactionary or counter-revolutionary painting. Liberty is painted with both breasts born, which is meant to be an image of immodesty, a kind of scandal, as opposed to one breast born, which is meant to be an image of liberty, right? So and many people note she's looking back, and there's people who seem to have a gun at her back, and the people are being trampled and worse. But in the context of today's course, I want to read this image a little bit differently, and to suggest to you that maybe another way of reading Delacroix is as saying liberty is reluctant. Liberty does not necessarily march ahead under her own steam, but requires popular backing in order to advance. And the revolutions of the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries seem to be the driving force in democratization in the world. It's worthwhile noting when we started our society, we called ourselves a republic, and we were really the first experiment with this kind of government in the modern world. And that since then, the majority of countries in the world now call themselves democracies, and at least 50 countries seem to have a constitution that embodies, institutionalizes democratic ideals. So the first week, right, that from the philosophical foundations to efforts at institutionalization, I want to look with you at Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Hamilton. And of course, Locke and Rousseau are revolutionary figures. Locke writes his two treatises of government in the very heat of a revolution, and the writings of Rousseau are revolutionary. They are banned. He becomes a fugitive because his writings are so inflammatory. They're not written in the context of a revolution, but within 20 years of their publication, they provoke a revolution. And so I want to look at those two texts, and then I want to contrast them a little bit with Montesquieu, Hamilton, Jay, and Madison, who are much more institutionalist. And in particular, Hamilton, Jay, and Madison, of course, are in the very process of trying to justify a constitution they have taken a primary role in drafting. And so they are perhaps less revolutionary, more pragmatic, as was the Baron de Montesquieu, not because he was actually in the middle of institutionalizing a revolutionary constitution, but because he himself was a magistrate in the old regime in France, and look at some of the thoughts, some of the tensions, some of the dynamics that are unleashed as people try to work out revolutionary democratic ideas. This, I hope, will ultimately give us a sense of both the radical appeal of these ideas and of the difficulty of adequately institutionalizing. I then want to turn to 19th century efforts at institutionalizing, reforming, broadening, or resisting democracy. And I start with Burke, who kind of straddles the period from the 18th to the 19th century. And famously, though he was in favor of the American Revolution, or at least of American independence, opposed the revolution in France. And look at the nature of modern anti-democratic reactionary to help maybe get some sense of where the resistance to democracy comes from. And then I want to look at Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, two progressive, liberal 19th century reformers, and their efforts to broaden democracy while also perhaps restraining democracy, an ambivalent sense that there is genuine promise to be realized in democracy, but also risk, hazard to be resisted. And then I want to focus a little bit on 20th century reactionary thought. And I think that the place to go, the locus classicus, is Carl Schmitt and his critique of parliamentary democracy during the Weimar period, and his call for authoritarian leadership, which eventually was used by the Nazis to justify and legitimate their regime. And then finally, Hannah Arendt's analysis of why in the middle of the 20th century, so many democratic societies succumbed to fascistic revolutions that, of course, ultimately threw the continent into a war and led to the deaths of millions of people. So with that background, and it's primarily philosophical, I want to turn much more directly to politics, and I'm going to do this in a pivot week in which I'm going to throw a lot of material together to try to get a synthetic sense of what is going wrong with democracy in the 21st century. We'll get some kind of appetizer version. I want to whet your appetites on these themes today, primarily to sound the alarm bell, to just say, look, these conditions feel an awful lot like the conditions of the early 20th century in which many democracies failed. Why are we replaying that dangerous episode in our relatively recent history again in the 21st century? And that will then lead into the long and main topic for the class, and that is how to reform democracy. And so the first thing I'm going to do with you is look at kind of bookends of one of the most important contemporary political scientists to have studied this topic. Bookends in the sense that Robert Putnam's first book that really established his reputation is this book, Making Democracy Work, which, like I say, is the study of Italy. And then compare that with what to date is his final book. He is now retired. I have no idea if he's at work on another project or not, but it certainly feels like his swan song book. And that's called The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And so a sense that the ideas that he originally articulated with regards to Italy can be applied to 21st century America as well. I think it gives us a really good sense of the way in which democratic reform is not a single institution, silver bullet kind of project. Get rid of the Electoral College, change the term limit on the Supreme Court so it's not a lifetime appointment, change representation in the Senate so that less populous states get less, more populous states get more. Go over to multi-member districts, which encourage greater partisan cooperation and discourage polarization and extremism. I could keep going. There are lots of recommendations for proposals that are purely political and kind of one institution reform, and they are good ideas, and I think we need to be looking at them. But part of what I think Putnam helps us to see is that the last time we made democracy work better in this country, we didn't do it by trying a single reform or narrow platform of reforms concentrated exclusively on the institutions of our federal government. We did it at the state and local level. We did it in society. We did it in our culture. It was and should be again a broad based social cultural project and not a narrowly institutional project. That then leads into more specific ideas for making democracy work better. And I start with the 21st century version of democratic theory or philosophy. And one of the things that leads me to want to teach this course now is that there's so much good literature on this and so many good ideas. Our need for new ideas is so urgent. I do think we are facing a genuine emergency, and at the same time, the ideas are out there, at least in the scholarship that I want to call your attention to. So we need to match those ideas with the circumstances we face. So general theoretical approaches. Then in week 6, I'm going to look at 2 particular ideas for institutional reform, and these might be called more conventional ideas for institutional reform, ideas about democratizing the rule of law. And here I need to walk a fine line. I am on the one hand very much aware, and I think we should all be grateful that the effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election results directed by then President Trump from the White House attempting to instrumentalize the central instruments of the executive branch against democracy. Those were effectively resisted by the institutions of the rule of law, especially by judicial institutions and judges throughout again and again the efforts to basically try to validate the obviously false claim that the election had been stolen. And they did so by maintaining evidentiary standards. You can't just assert this, you need to produce the evidence. But it is also the case that the Department of Justice and other White House lawyers resisted the effort to overturn the election results. And so it is worthwhile noting that of the institutions that we rely on, the judicial and legal institutions perhaps are holding up our democracy as well as any institutions right now. But having said that, I also think we need to be wary that particularly the Supreme Court, but also the judiciary as a whole, are increasingly behaving like partisan branches of government. And I will attempt to establish with you today and then later that one of our 2 parties is increasingly drifting in an anti-democratic direction. And if the members of the judiciary appointed by the Republican Party, and please note that that's the majority, obviously, in the Supreme Court, a supermajority, but a majority in the federal bench as a whole, if they start behaving like the party that appointed them, we may not be able to rely on the judiciary going forward to stabilize our democracy. And so how do we bring a branch of government constitutionalized in the 18th century into the 21st century? And I want to ask a similar question about the administrative state, which is the area of government not really envisioned by the Constitution that really took hold in the aftermath of the New Deal, and has swollen to be a huge portion of the way in which rule and governance are structured in the 21st century. And yet, it appears that the administrative state has a deep democratic deficit. What could we do to make the EPA or the Food and Drug Administration or the Occupational Health and Safety Administration or state and local bureaucracies more accountable? And again, really good, really interesting literature here. I'm looking forward to sharing with you. And then the final week, new practices for new problems. I'm going to focus a little bit here on climate change, on making better jobs, on artificial intelligence, on issues that are evolving so quickly that the old instruments of government seem incapable of responding to them in a sufficiently nimble way. And so how can we begin to adjust democratic government so that it is adequate to the problems of 21st century politics and governance, doing that through forms of reimagining democratic rule and experimentation, and in particular, environmental and economic democracy. So I hope that gives you a sense of where we're going. And I saw that Carla put the link to the course outline. As you can see, and for those of you who know me, I've thrown a whole bunch of books at you in this outline. I'm going to pick up my computer for a second and just show you. I've thrown a whole bunch of books around my office in doing the work to get ready for this class. I am not assuming that anybody is going to do anything like any of this reading. And to be as clear as possible, there's no need to. I don't assume familiarity with these texts. And on the other hand, I know that many of you are interested in getting recommendations and on a particular topic at least. I hope having these references may help you, if you are interested, to engage more deeply than we can do in 2-hour synthetic lectures. All right, so let me now really try to frame the issues in this course. And I will, after I do this, pause for a moment. I can see there's already one comment in the chat, and I definitely want to be in conversation, but let me start just or continue framing the problem. And I want to diagnose the democratic deformations that seem to be plaguing 21st century democracy. And you may know there are elections forthcoming in Poland that seem to, in many respects, hold the balance of whether or not Poland will continue to be a pluralistic, free democracy, or whether or not it may move in the direction of post-liberal, post-democracy, akin to what Hungary has done, that there are changes occurring in Israel with regards to the role of the judiciary. That's still in the balance, but certainly it makes it look like there's a real risk that Israel will move in a more autocratic direction, that there are very popular right-wing populist parties in many of the societies of the European Union and Britain today. And of course, as I've already alluded to, I believe that the Republican Party is increasingly moving in that direction. And by the way, I think that the Democratic Party is mirroring the Republican Party, not necessarily in moving in a populist authoritarian direction, but in the deep mistrust of the other side, the demonization of our democratic rivals, and that is not a healthy place for democracy to be. So Having said all of that, I want to go back a few hundred years and talk about a kind of institutionalized tension within democracy and its origins. And so to appreciate this, and we'll continue to explore these themes this week and next week, recognize that the rights that we now take for granted as constituting democracy, whether that's the right to vote in free, fair, open elections, the right to political speech and other forms of speech as a essential component of the idea that each of us should have the equal opportunity to influence the content and direction of public opinion, and thereby to influence what our government does. The right to assemble, the right to petition, the right to privacy. All of these rights emerge initially in the context of political revolutions. And they are at first articulated as revolutionary demands against autocratic governments, particularly against monarchies. And then when these revolutions succeed, they are institutionalized as rights that are themselves, the term of art here is judiciable. You can sue if those rights are not upheld by your government, and depending on how they're institutionalized, you have various kinds of legal remedy. But the rights that are institutionalized stop short of realizing the full revolutionary aspirations in which they emerged, right? And so the democratic ideas embodied in our culture and politics originate in revolutionary aspirations. Those ideas are institutionalized via constitutional rights. Those rights are ways of expressing aspirations that are necessarily counterfactual. That is to say, they cannot be fully realized. I'm going to get into the reasons in a moment, but let me just ask you, do you think you have an equal opportunity to influence the formation and direction of public opinion, and that our government pays attention to public opinion such that public opinion directs the kinds of policies it implements? And I'm not actually asking you to answer that question, but I'm trying to bring home to you the idea that most of us experience democratic politics primarily in the role of spectators and not in the role of participants. And that in a sense, it's hard to imagine a democracy with 350 odd million members in which each person felt they really had an equal right to influence public opinion, unless that rights influence were vanishingly small. I've got 1/350 millionth of the portion of public opinion that I can influence. That's not very much influence. The very idea of having a share of power that small dramatically diminishes its value. And so there's a sense in which the aspirations that are institutionalized via rights are never themselves going to be fully realized. And yet, these aspirations have been integrated into our self-understandings. And here, some of you have heard me say this before, I'm deeply impressed with the way a contemporary philosopher, Charles Taylor, expresses this idea. We are self-interpreting animals. When we conceive of ourselves in certain ways, it gives rise to us having an interest in being treated in those ways. We act as if the conception we have of ourselves is accurate and needs to be respected. And so I'm going to refer to that kind of desire or interest as a conception dependent desire. I desire ice cream because I like ice cream, not because I conceive of myself as an ice cream desiring person. And if I can't get ice cream, I'm going to be disappointed, but I'm not going to be insulted or wounded in the same way that if I conceive of myself as a good teacher and then I fail to teach well, I am going to be much more, I believe, disappointed than when I can't have my bowl of Haagen-Dazs at the end of the evening because I have disappointed something that is integrated into the way I think about myself. The reason I feel self respect and esteem is potentially damaged when I am not able to realize an ideal that I have integrated into my identity via the way I conceive myself. And so with that idea in mind, I want to suggest that many people in democracies conceive of themselves and want to be recognized by their fellow citizens and their main institutions as free and equal citizens in a self-determining people, right? Each one of us is equal, has an equal share of political power. Each one of us is free to make our own judgments about how to use that power. And we want to be recognized as such. We want our rights to allow us to act in accord with that self-understanding. Secondly, and relatedly, we also conceive of ourselves and our society as a cooperative enterprise, as one in which each of us gets a fair share of the proceeds of social cooperation, in which each of us is respected and has a standing as a contributing and therefore respected member of society. And that both of those ideals, an idea of the self, an ideal of the society, have been deeply woven into democratic institutions and democratic law, but more broadly into democratic political and civil culture. And they are inspiring ideals. And on the other hand, they are dangerous ideals because when they are disappointed, when they are thwarted, people tend to get angry. And that anger can be channeled in different ways, but often it becomes destructive. So these democratic aspirations that originate in revolutions, that change constitutions and as a result the structure of government, and then take on kind of a life of their own in which they get not only institutionalized but integrated into the way the people who animate those institutions, the people whose lives are structured by those institutions, understand themselves and each other. These aspirations make promises. They suggest a form of government, a form of organizing our shared political life in which no one is dominated by politics because all share equal in determining collective action. That is to say, each one of us can own the way our society acts on us because we are the co-authors of the laws, of the institutions, of its policies. And by the way, for that reason, those policies respect us as free and equal citizens and cooperative members of our society. And this then relates to a broader social ideal that I believe is directly connected with democracy, that our society will be just fair, cooperative, and democratic. And so I hope this is clear. Please let me know if it's not, but ideas that were articulated in revolutions 300, 250, 200, 150, or maybe as recently as 20 years ago, become institutionalized, take on a life of their own, give us expectations, and those expectations are radical and important to the way we understand ourselves, but they are necessarily counterfactual. That is to say, they can't simply be realized. And the reason they can't simply be realized is that we don't just live in a democracy, right? We live in a capitalist market society, and democracy and capitalism have independent logics. They point in different directions, they have different consequences. We live in a media society, increasingly in a digital and social media society. And those social structures also have different implications. And so to illustrate this idea, I point to the fact that a market economy may produce forms of inequality and vulnerability that are in tension with the ideals of equality and cooperation. And in a sense, if we were to simply, stomp our fists and demand, no, we live in a democracy, we should all have the level of equality that is demanded by democracy, our economy could very well tank, and none of us is going to be very happy with that either. So our social world is not just a democratic social world, it has other features, and democracy is tensely related to those other features. The functional social systems that compete with democracy have to work in order for us to be able to maintain ourselves, and therefore they tend often to limit or even thwart democracy. We add to that the revolutionary ideals that were articulated in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries were often looking backwards at Athens or Rome or Sparta or the Italian city-states of the late Middle Ages, and thinking about relatively small scale systems in which people were directly powered to lead their lives. And as opposed to that, we live in large scale, diverse, complex, and complicated societies. And in those societies, it's really hard to see how we could actually be fully empowered as citizens. We're never going to come to the assembly in 21st century America where we vote directly on each of the pieces of legislation. As opposed to that, modern democracy tends to be party democracy. We tend to vote for representatives. As representatives, we tend to vote for as members of political parties, and political parties tend to have oligarchic tendencies. They tend to concentrate power, to be more open to the influence of the wealthy who fund their operations. And so there seem to be some intrinsic limits on our capacity to effectively institutionalize democracy in the 21st century. The result then of having integrated into our self-understanding radical aspirations to equality, freedom, empowerment, cooperation, but living in a social world in which those aspirations are bound to varying degrees to be thwarted is a kind of perhaps creative or constructive, or else a potentially destructive tension built into our political lives and culture. I'm going to refer to this as a gradient of tension, right? So depending upon how big the difference is between our ideals and the way our institutions actually work, we can have a shallow or a steep gradient of tension. More or less discrepancy between the ideals and the practice. And what I want to suggest to you in particular is that steep gradients, political practice, social life that seems to be deeply contradictory to the official ideology of our society. We're a democracy, but whoa, all the power seems to go to only the people who are already rich and already uh, uh, powerful within various institutions. Democracy is a farce. Democracy doesn't really work the way it's supposed to. That leads to frustration and grievance. And then we have to notice that happens on a regular basis. In some sense, this tension is intrinsic to the evolution of democracy. That's why I suggested maybe we should read that Delacroix painting in a different way. It's not just, that the people are making liberty do libertine things. It's that the people have to push liberty, or else liberty will stall, right? And so in the right circumstances, the tension between what we believe our society should be and how it's actually operating results in reform, results in efforts to more fully and perfectly institutionalize democracy. And on the other hand, in the wrong circumstances, this kind of tension drives distrust in democracy, backsliding in which people withdraw their allegiance, and often a politics of scapegoating, which can take on a racial, ethnic dimension to it. And we're going to get further into this. Some of this depends on the leadership available to us. Is the leadership left wing or right wing populist, progressive or regressive? But some of it also depends on whether or not reform appears to be credible in the circumstances we face. And part of what I want to suggest to you is that in the 2020s, many people have concluded that reform is not credible, and that for those of us who want to maintain the democratic potential of the United States, it is incumbent on us not only to look back and say, look at what a hallowed tradition we have. Why should we want to violate that? But also to look forward and to say, look, we know democracy is not working the way it's supposed to. We too are frustrated, but the best solution to the problems of democracy is better democracy. And there are credible proposals to make democracy work better in the 21st century. We need to be exploring those proposals in order to begin advocating for reforms that could actually rechannel the politics of anger and grievance that is so hot and dangerous in America and much of the rest of the world in the middle of the 21st century into more constructive and progressive forms. So there you have it in a nutshell. What I hope to accomplish with you. I'm going to pull out for a second. I'm about to go into some detail about what is troubling American democracy in the 21st century. I know I've got at least one question in the chat, and I want to give you the opportunity if you have questions at this point. So George is saying, a nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. The traitor moves within the gates freely. His sly whispers heard in the very halls of government itself. And of course, that's Cicero, and one of the great practitioners of rhetoric and democracy. And so, yes, the traitor within is more dangerous than the enemy without. And by the way, I think one of the things that has weakened American democracy is the sense of an external enemy. When we defined ourselves against the Soviet Union, we wanted to uphold democracy for the world in order to prove that our system was the superior of the two rivals. We have, in a sense, I think, lost that sense of there's an external rival that we need to define ourselves against, and that should lead us to sharpen our commitment to democracy, right? And arguably the civil rights movement emerges out of that sense. We can't be an advocate for democracy in the rest of the world, a world that is mainly not white European people, if we're a racial tyranny at home, right? And then on the other hand, Cicero also rightly anticipates what contemporary political science has shown. I'm thinking in particular of How Democracies Die by Levitsky and Ziblatt, a book we'll talk about at greater length in a future lecture, who suggests that the vast majority, upwards of 90% of democratic failure, right, democracy being replaced by autocracy, authoritarianism, fascism, occurs not as a result of an external takeover of the government, but as a result of electing autocratic leaders who then refuse to relinquish power. So yes, thank you, George. Great use of Cicero to talk about some of the really important themes for this class. Anybody else at this juncture? All right, I'll jump back in if there aren't other questions, and I will pop out every now and then, but don't feel you have to wait for me to pop out. I can't tell. Joelle, are you trying to raise your hand, or are you just so you need to unmute yourself?
I'll go ahead and unmute you, Joelle. Go ahead, Joelle.
She's still muted. Joelle, if you hold your space bar down, if your device is like mine, try that. Just hold it down.
There you go.
Thank you, guys. Question, what is the role of factionalism, which seems to be strengthening? What's the impact of that?
And so factionalism, you're using the language of Madison. It's great.
I knew him well.
Yeah. The idea of partisanship, polarization, and increasingly, vehement partisan hatred. I think we have to recognize.
Yeah.
Yes, and by the way, I'm about to speak more about that. But the idea that on the one hand, the other side is either all woke idiots or racist degenerates, right?
Yeah.
We have so stereotyped each other that it makes it impossible to talk to each other. Impossible. And here I want to be as clear as possible. Democracy works best when we learn from the other side, when we not only listen, but we listen in the spirit of trying to figure out what kinds of mistakes we're making, because of course we all see the world from our perspective, right? And from our perspective, everything we believe looks naturally correct. We should recognize we're typically wearing blinders. We're typically, the contemporary psychological research calls this confirmation bias. Very good at finding the arguments that support the beliefs we already hold, and very bad at finding for ourselves the criticisms that actually should lead us to change our position. And so what democracy does when it works well is institutionalize antagonism so that we can learn from each other. And that requires not only that we differ, but also that we respect each other in order to be able to listen and learn from each other. And I do think that that's very much in danger right now. By the way, Madison said, you cannot eliminate factions, right? All you can do is try to use them as productively as possible. But I do think that the degree of antagonism between parties is obviously historically variable, and we're at a pretty low point in America in the 2020s in this regard. So I saw Pamela's hand go up next. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This kind of segues, and I'm not sure, I think at some point in the course you might explore this further, but I'm just curious, one of the things that wasn't around in the past was the social media, and the way that has contributed to our polarization. I'm just wondering, and how it's, created these bubbles where we can't seem to emerge very easily and have these discussions with the other side. I'm just wondering what you think in terms of, that ultimate aspiration of getting to a better democracy, how that can take place, given the power of social media, and then algorithms, and yet to come AI.
Yeah, not yet to come. It's here, and it's going to keep getting more and more powerful, and it's not for today, but there's some literature on the idea that the more chatbots generate content in our socially mediated public sphere, the more they will feed on their own content, because the way chatbots work is by studying what's out there, and so that we're going to get a self-reinforcing loop of disinformation coming from chatbots. But let me pull back to the broader claim here, and so that social media, digital media, let me add 24/7 news, and news that caters only to those people who are already convinced, so the so-called filter bubble model of news, that all of this has deeply disorganized our public sphere. And I do agree with that, and I also want to point out that this is a fundamental change, and you put it well, between 18th and 19th century ideas and 20th and 21st century ideas. In the 18th and 19th century, the public sphere was primarily a literary public sphere, meaning people read the news, right? And when you read the newspaper, it is a different kind of attention, a different kind of engagement, a different level of critical intelligence that is, if you will, summoned by the medium itself, than when you watch the news on TV or see your news feed on your handheld device, right? And so this claim that we have become much more susceptible to disinformation because we're now in a many-to-many as opposed to a one-to-many media environment with no filters, with no gatekeepers, with no professional journalists trained in journalistic ethics to determine what should circulate in our public sphere, I think is exactly right. And it gets at a broader claim, which is that in the 21st century, unlike in the 18th century, perhaps, we no longer have a social environment that is per se supportive of democracy. And so we may need to work harder to build a supportive social environment. And that may include media regulation, but it also includes the way in which we use the media. We have to not only ask the government to regulate it, we have to support good, critical, reliable, verifiable media, and as a public, not make it profitable for news stations and other outlets to be propaganda amplifiers in the way that so many are today. And so having said all that, let me say one more thing, which is I already spoke of how difficult it is to institutionalize democratic ideals in large-scale, complex societies. These new media platforms actually also have important democratic potentials if we use them in a different way. And so I just want to note that double-edged aspect to it. We can't use them to simply circulate mis and disinformation and to engage in the politics of caricature of our enemies. But having said that, if we did build institutions in the way that some countries have that draw on the democratic potential of social media, we might actually be able to reform not only our democracy, but maybe even our engagement with media. Great question. Thank you. EJ, I see you've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead.
Yes. What is happening in the state of Wisconsin seems to be a template for democracy being replaced by autocracy. It fits your paradigm very neatly, and it frightens me because if everybody catches on to this, as it would appear to be in the realm of the GOP proposal for government, then we're going to be in very difficult trouble. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, and in particular, I assume that you're referring to the efforts to recall the recently elected member of the Supreme Court in Wisconsin.
Absolutely.
So the politicization of the judiciary, and this idea that you may be familiar. This goes back to the 1990s, and when David Souter was appointed by George H.W. Bush, and they thought they were getting a good, reliable conservative, but it turned out he was much more moderate, and in particular, in his role as a Supreme Court justice, he said, "My duty is not to the party, it's to the Constitution." And therefore, for instance, he voted to uphold Roe v. Wade, right, in the famous Casey decision. So the rise to the slogan, "No more suitors," meaning no more members of the judiciary who are not going to reliably follow the party's political and policy positions, right? And I think that's incredibly dangerous and destructive for the judiciary. It is not a partisan institution. It is an institution whose fundamental duty is to the rule of law and the Constitution. And so, yes, the fact that partisan politics seems to know no bounds in the 21st century. It gets back to Joelle's question, right, about factionalism and how extreme our partisan divides have become. And yes, I think Wisconsin is a case study, and I wasn't going to talk about it today, but there's really wonderful scholarship on the politics of rural resentment in Wisconsin, and the way in which the members of the Wisconsin non-urban population felt that their urban population was going in one direction and it was completely ignoring the rest of the state. And so the rest of the state fought back, and when Republicans won a majority, and this is a famous case study, right, went after the unions and then redistricted, and then it essentially tried to make it as difficult as possible for the Democratic Party in Wisconsin ever again to gain power, right?
Yes.
This idea that we need to treat politics as a no-holds-barred sport, not a system in which we take turns ruling, and that we learn from our defeats, but in which any defeat is an existential threat. This is part of what's really, I think, heightening the political temperature the degree of animosity and factionalism in our politics, and it just gets more and more high stakes when we go after the judiciary, etc. So yes, EJ, a really good example. Thank you for that. It has gotten to be, George, go ahead. I see you got your hand up. I'm going to take one more comment and then we'll go for a break for about 5 minutes.
Yeah, just a comment. The founders, who were highly educated, influenced by the Enlightenment, read the Republic, and in their writings in the Federalist Papers clearly were very suspicious of the concept of democracy, and built into the Constitution multiple barriers, so to speak. The question is, from a democratic standpoint, is our Constitution still relevant?
So you caught me at the end there. I was thinking you were going one way and you went another direction. I'll just show you very quickly. I've been working a lot with this book recently. It's not on my reading list, but this is called The Founders' Coup. It's by Michael Claremont, who's a professor at Harvard Law School. And he makes a claim similar to the claim you're making, which is that the founders, the people who met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to draft the Constitution, thought the United States was suffering, in the words of one of them, from an excess of democracy, and that they were trying to put the post-revolutionary genie back into the bottle, right? And there's pretty good evidence that a fair bit of our Constitution was designed to subdue or contain or routinize the revolutionary democratic impulse so that we could go back to a more moderate and elite dominated form of politics. If they had succeeded in that project, I don't think we would be very proud of our Constitution or its history. But what I would say is, and this is, I think, the genius of Claremont's book, and just noting something I think many others have noted, that the Constitution has been used, has been changed, has been both formally and informally amended to make it a much more democratic institution, or a much more democratic structure, right? So we now have fairly universal adult suffrage in the United States. Of course, in the early years of the Republic, it was white property men who were exclusively entitled to vote. That's a long, difficult struggle to get there. And, you know, that's just one illustration of many ways in which we have reformed the original structure, the original intent, perhaps, of the Constitution, to make it not only more Republican, as the founders would have preferred to say, but more democratic. And so I don't think that the fact that the Constitution bears the imprint of elites who were suspicious of democracy has determined its life completely. It's a different document in the 21st century, and hopefully it can continue to be a living document that's part of the idea behind this course, that we don't need to junk the Constitution, but we do need to continue to maintain its capacity to grow, to be extended, to meet us in the 21st century where we are now. All right.
You have just made a cogent rebuttal against originalism.
Yes. Well, and by originalism, I think of as deeply incoherent, but that's a topic for another day. All right, everybody. So let's take our 5-minute break and come right back, because there's plenty of territory still to cover. Talk to you soon.
Great. Great
Thank
questions,
you.
everyone. Thank you. See you in 5.
Carla, do you want to pause the? Oh, I guess I can pause the recording. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to jump back into my slides, and as you know, I am very much inclined to be ambitious in these lectures. And we're going to see. We're not going to cover everything I had anticipated for today, but let me do as much as I can. And so I want to start with having set up this framework, right, in which there's kind of built-in tension in democracy, that we have articulated aspirations that in a sense can't be fully realized, that those aspirations are built both into constitutions and into popular self-understandings connected with our self-respect and esteem, that tension can be productive or destructive depending upon how it's challenged. It can lead to ongoing progress in the effort to better realize the ideal of democracy, or it can lead to loss of faith, backlash, populist reactions, right? And so my suggestion is that it's incumbent upon us in the 21st century to take the first and not the second path, but that our politics seem to be sliding down that second path, and it is urgent. And so what I want to start discussing with you is that urgency and some signs that democracy is not working well in the 21st century. Exhibit A, climate change. And I refer here primarily to earlier years. We're still in the middle of 2023. But if we were to update the information, it would be even worse in 2023. This is a record-breaking year in terms of global temperature, in terms of what's happening in the oceans with El Nino, in terms of destructive weather, extreme weather. And yet, and here's the tie-in with politics, the democracies, right? The societies that you would think would be most accountable, most responsive to people saying, oh my goodness, this is an existential threat. We have to stop. We have to do something. They are mainly not taking action that is matched to the extremity, the severity, the urgency of the threat. The second issue, and this is where I'll really concentrate, and this is where several of your questions have taken me, this idea that we're in a world of polarization, disinformation, scapegoating, and backsliding, right? And so I've got a whole bunch of evidence on the board right now that I'm going to unpack in a little bit more detail as we try to explain it. But the idea that a quarter of Americans think that the 2020 election was stolen, despite the fact that the evidence to that effect is all specious, is purely disinformation. And 8% of Americans say violence is justified to reverse the election. That this is then reflected particularly in Republican views about using force, about supporting strong leaders, taking law into our own hands, not trusting elections we lose, and then the idea that there are 262 bills. This is a little out of date at this point. I don't keep track of it every day, but that are efforts to restrict access to the ballot, to gerrymander, etc., to essentially game the rules of democracy to support one side, excluding the other side from having a fair chance at winning. That people who feel high levels of racial resentment are unlikely to support government, even when they are also economically vulnerable, and therefore they're increasingly pushed into a kind of resentment politics that defeats their own interests. The idea that we have one party that increasingly mirrors the racial composition in the United States, a second party, which is, I have to admit, growing in the diversity of its leadership, but not in the composition of its rank and file. The Republican Party is basically a 90% white party. It is more or less where it was 50 years ago in terms of the racial composition of its voters, and that is driving a lot of these disenfranchisement and resentment politics. That there is a large percentage of the people who think the election was stolen or violence should be used, who also believe that African American and Hispanic people will eventually have more rights than whites, believe the idea that QAnon, that there's a satanic cult running the government primarily in order to have a child trafficking pedophile ring. Crazy stuff is believed by a substantial portion of the American population. And so I take that and I'm going to drill more deeply into it, but as evidence that our democracy is in trouble in the 21st century. And again, I think one of the things that we'll get into this in the second and third week of the class, that you fault European liberals of the early 20th century for is not sounding the alarm loudly enough, not really reckoning with the threat to democracy that the growing fascist movement presented, thinking that that's the past and we're headed ineluctably into a future of greater democratic freedom, when in fact they were actually headed in the exact opposite direction. Half a second. I forgot to plug in my computer and I don't want it to die with 15 minutes left in the lecture. Okay, so this is a slide I've used in the past. I update it, but it's, I think, mainly familiar, that there are some real signs that democracy is damaged in the United States that we can point to in terms of an explanation for it, and how hard it is for democracy to navigate the social, cultural, technological, media environment of the 21st century. And so I'm going to point to these as proximate explanations for the problems democracy is having right now. Proximate meaning this is the short-term stuff. This is the stuff this decade, but as opposed to more long-term factors that we will get further into as we progress the course. Rapid and disintegrative cultural change. I'll show a little bit more evidence in a moment, but whether we're talking about becoming quite quickly a multicultural society in which there is no racial majority, or the rapid change in gender norms and norms surrounding sexual identity, rapid and dislocating economic change. Again, point to this in detail in a few minutes, but a tremendous return of inequality, a really disturbing growth in the size of the population experiencing economic precariousness, and the kinds of people experiencing precariousness, especially white working class people who really thought, based on what the country did in the middle of the 20th century, that they were on a path to much greater economic security, having the rug pulled out from under them in that regard. Rapid and disruptive technological change. We've talked about this already with the growth of digital media, 24/7 news, the spread of social media. But please note, it's not just that, it's artificial intelligence, it's robotics, it's globalization, and what that's doing not only to our public sphere, but our economy, is a rapid, dramatic, structural change that many people experience as very threatening for very good reasons, right? Rapid demographic change. We went from artificially suppressing immigration through racist, xenophobic laws in the middle of the 20th century to opening the doors to immigration. And while I'm inclined to think that the description of the United States as having a migrant crisis or a refugee crisis in the 2020s is overblown. It is clearly the case that we're in a period in which immigration and different rates of reproduction are rapidly altering the demographics of the country. And again, this is making some people feel disoriented, dislocated, threatened. Decline in bottom-up organization and mobilization. The clearest example here would be the decline in unions, which for many people were not just a way of representing their interests vis-a-vis their employers, but also a way of feeling included and empowered via organizations that they could actually participate in a way that determined outcomes where their votes actually mattered. Because often the leadership of the local chapter of the union was very closely contested, and your vote mattered there, and then that mattered in further positions that your union was going to take. And then we could talk about, and this is something that Robert Putnam focuses on a lot, all kinds of other civil society organizations, and that includes things like PTAs and Lions clubs, but also bowling leagues, that there was a sense of greater participation in the civic life of the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And we have become a country of people who stay home and watch Netflix or YouTube rather than going out and congregating and getting to know each other and feeling some empowerment as a result. This is supplemented by, met halfway by, the elite capture of democratic institutions that have become increasingly unresponsive. I'll show you more data on this as well, but if you wanted to point your finger one place, you could get a simplistic explanation by pointing to Citizens United and the way in which it and then subsequent Supreme Court decisions have opened the floodgates in American politics for money to the point where a few families, a few hundred families, provide the majority of money for our elections, and as a result have outsized influence on what the parties do, which issues they place on, and which issues they take off of the political agenda. The authoritarian drift of one of our main parties, we've already talked about that. I'll talk about it more going forward, but this is, right, going back to George's Cicero quote, the chief way in which I think perhaps the most persuasive account of how democracies die shows how democracies are in fact overthrown from within, not because of a single authoritarian populist leader generally, but because a whole political party and its members, its followers, its voters go in the direction that the party takes it, and the party takes it against democracy. We've talked about the restructuring of the public sphere. I'll add our knowledge systems, the growing mistrust of experts, which we saw with regards to medical expertise in the coronavirus pandemic, but more generally, the sense that we don't have to believe what courts say. We don't have to believe what climate scientists say. We don't have to believe what economists say if it does not agree with our gut level instincts. And this is, I think, one of the additional dangers of Donald Trump as a political leader. He is a post-truth politician. His refrain, trust me, right? My gut is more reliable than all those Ivy League educated experts. This is also, I think, profoundly unsettling to the way in which a democracy tries to be guided by rational, valid, verifiable opinion about factual matters, matters of science, could and should guide matters of policy. And then the resurfacing of these deep currents of nativism and populism, of so-called white nationalism, the idea that citizenship is a marker of white racial status and superiority. Again, stuff that I really think we thought we had turned the corner on, closed the door on, put behind us, is back coursing through the veins of our politics. Let's see, Debbie has in the chat, how can Trump run for president if he doesn't accept Joe Biden as the current elected president or the system that validated his election? If it was rigged or a lie, how does he run in what he considers a rigged system? There's no way he will accept any result that doesn't elect him. And so I think, Debbie, you know, you're primarily expressing frustration at the hypocrisy here, and let's just notice, right, that and we're about to get into this, that the majority of Republican elected officials in the United States today, at least at the national level, deny that the 2020 presidential election was correctly decided, and yet they are there as a result of the outcomes of that election. They don't say, well, maybe my election was decided by fraud, but if the other side wins, they cry fraud, right? And so yes, there is, and this comes back to the party, right? That I'm drawing heavily on Levitsky and Zablat, How Democracies Die. No, I can't find. Yes, I can. The book that we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of weeks looks like that, and its authors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat. But the idea that when political parties function well, they both socialize and discipline their leaders to adhere to core democratic norms. That includes, of course, respecting the outcome of elections you didn't win, and that we are now in a world where we have major democratic parties that are not playing that role, major parties in a democracy like the United States, but also like France, like Britain, like Israel, where the party seems increasingly to be turning its members, its voters against core democratic norms. And of course, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Russia, etc. The list is long. So let me now introduce a concept. This is from Colin Krauss, a British political scientist, goes back now almost 20 years, that he calls post-democracy. And so just listen to what Colin Crouch has to say for a second. Democracy thrives when there are major opportunities for the mass of ordinary people actively to participate through discussion and autonomous organizations in shaping the agenda of public life, and when these opportunities are being actively used by them. This is ambitious and expecting very large numbers of people to participate actively in serious political discussion and in framing the agenda rather than be the passive respondents to opinion polls, and to be knowledgeably engaged in following political events and issues. This is an ideal model which can almost never be fully achieved, but like all impossible ideals, it sets a mark. It is always valuable and intensely practical to consider where our conduct stands in relation to an ideal, since in that way we can try to improve. It is essential to take this approach to democracy rather than the more common one, which is to scale down definitions of the ideal so that they can conform to what we easily achieve. That way lies complacency, self-congratulation, and an absence of concern to identify the ways in which democracy is being weakened. And then Crouch in the book suggests that as opposed to that ideal, we are now in primarily post-democracies. Elections continue. Debate, however, is tightly controlled, managed by rival teams of professionals, experts in the techniques of persuasion, and considering a small range of issues selected by those teams, right? So it's elites who frame the debate, and the rest of us don't participate in the framing of the issues. We just root for our side primarily as spectators. The mass of citizens plays a passive, quiescent, even apathetic part, responding only to the signals given to them. Behind this spectacle of the electoral game, politics is really shaped in private by interactions between elected governments and elites, which overwhelmingly represent business interests. And then his central contention is that the forms of democracy have been preserved at the same time that they have been hollowed out, and elite control is continuing to maintain a tight grip on the agenda of democracy, even as democratic forms make it appear that the people are in power, right? And the sign that this is happening, to get more deeply into the data, is that over the last 50 years, as opposed to becoming more equal, we have become much more unequal. We were in a period of rapidly accelerating inequality, a period that is, I think, appropriately referred to as a new Gilded Age. And the result is that a large portion of our population not only has seen their economic position decline relative to others, but has been rendered increasingly economically vulnerable and precarious. This diagram shows you that 46% of the American population lives on less than $30,000 a year, and that substantial portions of that population live on less than $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 a year. And obviously, right, when we look at homelessness, when we look at people who are being foreclosed on or evicted, the spiral of housing insecurity that tends to generate. When we look at the fact that in many of our major cities, 40 to 50% of children experience food insecurity. They're not eating well in the summers when they're not able to get a meal or two at their schools. We see the human costs of this failure of government to arrest the growth of inequality in the 21st century. What does this do to democracy? And these are diagrams that I think are too stunning not to return to. On the one hand, right, the share of campaign funding in the United States coming from the top 0.01% of the population is now 40%. 400 odd families provide a little bit over 50% of the funding for elections. And this is, right, mirroring, but in fact accelerated vis-a-vis the share of the wealth of the top 0.1%. And this is accompanied by this, I think, really important research that shows that the average American voters' preferences, when they conflict with the economic elite's preferences, have absolutely no bearing on how our representatives decide issues, right? This is a flat line. If 0 to 10% of the population, or if 80 to 100% of the population supports an issue, it makes no difference to the likelihood of that issue actually getting through Congress. Whereas when economic elites don't support an issue, it doesn't get through. When they do support, it has a much greater likelihood of being passed. The same thing is true now of interest groups and lobby, right? So the economic elite, we're just talking about very rich individuals. Interest groups, we're talking about lobbyists, professional organizations that are trying to influence governments. By the way, please note, Citizens United gave these organizations free speech rights. And that this is, again, an indication that perhaps Crouch is right, that in the 21st century, we're no longer a democracy, even though we maintain the formal legal institutions like regular free elections. They don't determine how power is exercised. A democracy is not just about elections, it's about popular empowerment. And we have become so unequal that that has become basically a completely counterfactual idea. Doug says in the chat, is not where we live a more limiting effect on democracy than income, race, etc.? Only 7 or so states matter in electing a president. It really does not matter if we vote in California. Well, geography does matter, especially in national presidential elections, right? And just to the same, in the same way, districting matters, right? So you could say, if you live in Northern California, who you vote for doesn't make much of a difference because the districts are so dominated by a single party, only the primary vote maybe matters, right? But having said that, that then points to an issue that needs to be addressed. You know, how can we structure democracy? Should we not replace the Electoral College with a popular vote, or perhaps as opposed to that, just bypass the Electoral College via legislation? And in so doing, then the votes in California start to matter a lot more. So this presents an institutional need. But having said all of that, Doug, I also want to say, well, so there's 7 or so states that matter, but how are elections in those states decided? Are they decided primarily on the basis of persuasion, of which candidate and party makes the best argument, does the best job at organizing voter turnout, etc.? Or are they decided by these big campaign expenditures that really concentrate their efforts on swinging the swing states, in which case these issues of wealth distribution still matter a great deal? EJ saying again, isn't this the elitism that the framers had in mind? And I want to say back to you, EJ, just for a second, that I think the framers would actually be frightened by these outcomes, and in particular by the Make America Great Again, the MAGA drift in the Republican Party, but more generally by the total non-responsiveness of these institutions. The framers were concerned with tax rebellions and with debt relief that farmers were demanding. And so, you know, there were things that they viewed as excessive democracy, but I don't think they envisioned a totally non-responsive elite captured alternative. And having said that, again, I just got to bring home the idea, we're not having a debate about what the Constitution meant to the framers. We're having a discussion about what we want the Constitution to do for us, what we want democracy to do for us in the 21st century. And my suggestion to you is that 90% of the population should come together in agreeing that we don't want this outcome. We have to figure out then how to channel that negative conclusion into a positive agenda for reform. Now, I just want to take a slightly longer perspective on this, and here I'm drawing on Robert Putnam's recent work. And as you can see, income equality in the United States and wealth equality actually improved dramatically from the beginning of the 20th to the middle of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th to the middle of the 20th for both income and wealth. And then we basically reversed course, fully reversed course with regards to income, partially reversed course with regards to wealth. And I want to suggest that this is a classic case of disappointed or dashed rising expectations. People, when they're on this trajectory, tend to expect this trajectory to continue. They tend not to anticipate the whiplash of the reversal of what most of them regarded as progress. And so much more dangerous than simply having maintained the same level of inequality over the course of the 20th century is the pattern we have actually adhered to, which is a pattern of increased equality followed by decreased equality. That really creates anger, resentment, and that's what's playing out in our politics. We know, by the way, some of the policies, right? Whether we're talking about the progressivity of the federal income tax or the corporate tax rate, both became much more progressive over the course of the first 50 years of the 20th century, and then stalled, and then became much more regressive over the last third of the 20th century. That's not the whole picture, but that's a pretty good sign that as inequality rose, the government, as opposed to countering it, accelerated our growing inequality, growing vulnerability, growing precariousness, transition to a new Gilded Age. By the way, this in turn has both accelerated the move in the direction of increased partisanship, increased factionalism or polarization. So cross-party collaboration in Congress went up and up in the first half of the 20th century and has actually declined below where it was in the late 19th century. Cross-party comedy or conflict, cooperation or conflict, as reported in the national presses, went up over the first third of the 20th century, plateaued, and then has rapidly reversed course in the 21st century. And so this then gets us into, in particular, what's happening with the Republican Party. And here I just have to spend a few minutes talking with you about the way in which the 21st century Republican Party is not only very different from the party of Lincoln, obviously, but also from the mainstream pro-business but quite moderate party of the middle of the 20th century. Matthew Continetti tells the story in his book On the Right of how mainstream conservatism ultimately relied on strains of populism represented by McCarthy and the Birch Society that eventually it lost control of and that took over the party. One sign that it's taken over the party is that the majority of the elected officials, the majority of the electorate of the Republican Party believes that the 2020 election was stolen, headed into the 2024 election. There is growing mistrust in electoral democracy in one of the main two parties in an electoral democracy. And then we add to this that the criminal prosecution of Donald Trump, now playing out in 4 trials at both the state and the national election, judicial levels, having to do with allegations of trying to overturn the election, holding on to and covering up the possession of classified documents, paying hush money to cover up an affair, that this is being denied, right? That there's any basis in law or evidence that this is purely political persecution, election interference, a witch hunt. And as you can see, the vast majority of Republican national elected officials reacted against the first indictment, dismissing it as credible, before they had access to the actual indictment. They were predetermined what their view was going to be. Again, I want to suggest this indicates that one of our two main parties is increasingly a post-truth, post-democratic, potentially anti-democratic party. And to offer an explanation, I just need to look at the time here for a moment. I think I've got enough time to handle this. That this is a reaction against the direction that they see American culture and society headed in for the last 50 years. That we have been becoming an increasingly what sociologists call post-traditional society, and that is for many of us a good thing, that our gender norms permit of greater equality between the sexes, that there is greater sexual freedom, greater freedom in terms of how you choose to structure your sexual and family life, greater freedom in terms of your ability to marry someone of the same sex, someone of a different race, to not have a conventional patriarchal family model. Yet we also have to recognize that for many Americans, this is threatening. And so this idea that there is a segment of the population that finds rapid cultural change, especially change that erodes tradition, to be threatening, that this leads them to then look for leaders who want to reimpose order, now order that is not just organically reproduced because individuals subscribe to it out of conviction, but imposed by the state in the name of maintaining tradition, that is an inherently authoritarian direction. And that this is very reminiscent of what happened in the first third of the 20th century, where there was also rapid urbanization and a movement in a much more cosmopolitan, some would say bohemian direction in the culture at that moment, and a sharp cultural backlash against the rate of social cultural change. The major social movements of the second half of the 20th century, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the environmentalist, immigrant, and LGBTQ rights movements, really showed the taken for granted central cultural roles and identities, and the social solidarities they generate were not as consensually held as many took for granted. That while they were the dominant, hegemonic cultural ideals, many of the people forced into the identities that those ideals created for us did not feel empowered or respected by those identities, and chose, as the 20th century continued, to challenge those ideals. That this effort to challenge those ideals as illegitimate has generated status anxiety and provoked backlash on the part of those who are more at home, either because they occupy a position of power within the way these identities are organized, or simply because they want to continue to adhere to these identities. They are comfortable. They are forms of identity that give them clear, taken for granted roles that allow them to understand what their place in society is, what is expected of them. And this is then reinforced by what we've just been talking about, the growing inequality. I think it would have been much easier for the United States to manage this transition into a post-traditional culture if we had not at the same time become a much more unequal society. People conflate those two things, right? That they're very unhappy about the fact that their economic security and respect, the pillar of their sense of social belonging, has been attacked by recent economic change. You add to that at the same time that their identities are being challenged, and they tend to view those who challenge their identities as also responsible for undermining their economic security. That is a toxic stew. That is where the politics of resentment and grievance takes hold and becomes popular. And so I do believe that we have two issues here. We add to that the idea that social media plays on grievance, plays on resentment, plays on anger and anxiety, that we know that these algorithms are designed to channel you into places that amplify your emotions. And we've got a real toxic stew in our politics in the 21st century, driving one of our two main parties into this politics of grievance and resentment, this politics that says we need strong leaders who don't respect procedural niceties like rights or the rule of law in order to reassert some strong sense of cultural order, some greater sense of economic protection. I'm going to stop here for now, recognizing that I only have 5 minutes left. I've got a couple, I think, remarks in the, maybe just one remark in the chat, but I want to leave a moment for comments as well. A book recommendation, Colin Woodward, American Nations, and it has insights into the variable cultural backgrounds of American immigration and how it influences today's cultural values. Thank you for that, George. I'll take a look. I have not taken a look at it yet. Anybody else with a book recommendation, a comment, a thought, even better, something that you want to disagree with? Anybody, or are we all ready for lunch? All right. Well, we did not get to talk about very much John Locke or Baron de Montesquieu or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or the Federalists today. They made their way in just a little bit. And that's my fault. Like I say, I tend to bite off more than I can chew. It's also the case that we had some very good dialogue today. So I'm very happy with that. I will cover some of those themes next week, in addition to looking at the 19th century philosophical roots of democratic ideals and some of the pushback against them. Very happy to be back in the flow with you guys, having a lot of fun. Look forward to seeing everybody next week. Take care. Be well. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.